a shame-based society not like many other, but like most East Asian societies. So this is extremely important to recognize that China's future, politically, economically, culturally, will not simply be a function of modernity in the abstract, but as a result of what it inherits historically and culturally from its past. And this will be true politically as well. I mean, I really think that China, we will see over the next 10, 20 years, some profound political changes in China, profound political reforms. But I don't think we should expect them to be simply a cloning of the Western tradition. I don't think it's going to happen like that. I think it'll be very interesting to see what does happen, but I think it will draw heavily on the Chinese tradition and come up with something quite distinctive. And incidentally, I mean, if you doubt me, think of Japan. I mean, often Japan is classified as a Western-style democracy. I'm sorry, I don't accept this. It does have the trappings of a Western-style democracy. It does have a multi-party system. It does have universal suffrage. But actually, that's not the way power really works in Japan. Power works in a completely different way. Power is essentially concentrated in Japan in the hands of the bureaucracy, and this is historically been true for a long time. And what's more, you know, it's not just the elites, but it's what the Japanese public respects. And why? Because it's a function of the Shintoist tradition. So if it's true in Japan, I would say it's going to be a lot more true in China itself. So I would envisage the future of China being understood in this broad terms. It's modernity, a new modernity shaped by Chinese history and the Chinese experience. And I just want to add one third factor. The third factor. First, modernity. Secondly, history. Thirdly, China's relationship with the world. I mean, this is a new player, really, on its scale and, of course, on its geographical reach. And this is constantly going to reinvent, or if you like, or renew, or redefine what China is. But one word of caution about this. The assumption generally in the past has been that China's relationship with the world will essentially be one-way traffic, i.e., from the West to China. Really, the process is one of China's opening up being one of Westernization. Now, for a period, that has been the case. I think there's no doubt that after Deng Xiaoping and so on, when China first started to export in the way it did and so on, that was, broadly speaking, it was overwhelmingly, I think, a one-way traffic. But that has already changed. That is no longer the case. And as China rises, China becomes more wealthy, China becomes more influential, China becomes the largest economy in the world, then the traffic will not be one way. It will not even be mainly one way. It will increasingly be two-way. And ultimately, I believe that the traffic will increasingly be from China to the West, or China to other parts of the world, which is already the case, of course, with some continents like Africa, to a lesser extent Latin America, and so on. So I think we stand to finish we're looking for I think in this next 10 years or so is going to be an extremely interesting period for China, extremely interesting. I think there will be many changes, but along the lines that I've been talking about, in the terms I've been talking about, I think that it'll be very complicated, it'll be very difficult, there will be many struggles, there will be many conflicts and arguments, but I'm confident that there's a good chance that China can come through this process greatly strengthened and looking, in many ways, increasingly attractive as well. And bear in mind that over the next 10 years, we're likely to see, China will be probably almost certainly be the largest economy in the world, maybe 1.5 times the size of the United States. Likely we'll see a new kind of foreign policy slowly evolve over the next period, a new style of economy, which is being widely talked about, and probably some very important political changes. I wish you a happy and successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jack, for your very thought-provoking speech. Now let's welcome our last speaker for this session, Professor Tu Weiming, Founding Dean of Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies, Peking University. Let's welcome.
I'm very grateful to have such a rare opportunity to share my ideas about China's transition from the point of view of cultural China. I'm very much in agreement with Luo Wei's idea that the Chinese diaspora will play a very critical role in shaping China's emerging cultural identity. Hopefully, it will be open, pluralistic, and self-reflexive. My thesis actually is very simple. I think the transition, if we think about it in terms of the best scenario, is to move from the fully embodied idea of the economic man, based upon the great inspiration of the Enlightenment mentality of the modern West. And from there, to become a humane person in the global context in reference to ecological, international, financial, and other crises. In other words, whether China would be able to be recognized not only by ourselves but by people abroad, that China can internalize the great Western values to become a major player in the economic, political, cultural arena. And then beyond, because that model of the modern West is inefficient or defective in reference to the major challenges of the 21st century. You know, some most brilliant minds of the West began to think about ecological, feministic, communitarian, religious, pluralistic, and culture diverse issues. So we have to move beyond the Enlightenment mentality. But yet, we need to first embody it. I think the idea whether China can be truly modern in this sense. What is the economic man? It's a very simple, hopefully not simple-minded version. It's a person who is a rational animal. Rationality means the person is quite critically aware of his own self-interest. Such a person attempts to maximize his profit, his soul, his spirit, his body, devoted to the maximization of his own profit in a free market, relatively free market, adjudicated by law. So some of the great values that we all appreciate are present in the formulation of this kind of economic person or economic man. Freedom, rationality, human rights, your own rights, sense of rights consciousness, legality, and certainly the dignity of the individual. China, as an unfolding economy, maybe extremely powerful economy, is flawed in all these areas. In fact, there are two scenarios. One is a scenario we're all talking about because it's the only scenario we think hopefully will emerge. But this is another scenario nobody wants to talk about it. Because if that happens, we're doomed. No one of us will be able to say anything. It's a major collapse. And I think it's real. Since the financial crisis shows the world can collapse. China can collapse economically, politically, and ecologically. If you live in Beijing, you know it's difficult, right? So the good life is in London, visiting the British Museum, enjoy the conversation, polite conversation here, and have nice food, of course. The bad life is to suffer from pollution and to cut in the traffic jam and to know most of your students are not interested in culture, but also only in business. But anyway. So in order to move from this particular idea, in order to develop, we need to develop freedom. I think China is not a free society. In Hong Kong, you feel all kinds of information is available. When you arrive in Beijing, half of the information that should be available is blocked. So you feel constrained, especially for an intellectual. It's insufferable. That needs to be changed. China, the legal system, I attended part of the discussion yesterday. The legal system is in pretty bad shape and needs to be revitalized. No market economy is going to survive without legality. We now don't have a very good legal system. And of course, rationality, not instrumental rationality, but rationality broadly defined is needed. Not to mention the dignity of the individual and the human rights. I argue very forcefully in China, human rights more important than sovereignty rights, more basic than sovereignty rights. If we don't understand human rights, we're in trouble. We're not part of the civilized world in the modern times because China has signed all the declarations, human rights. The United States has failed to sign quite a few of them. But anyway, we need to live up to that expectation. One promising sign for me with the new leadership is that I think for the first time that they recognize development has to be comprehensively understood. It's not just economic development. It's political, social, cultural, and even ecological. And yet, the real challenge is not to have a comprehensive idealistic vision, but how you develop mechanism, you can do the real negotiation. There's a conflict between GDP and quality of life based upon ecological concerns. What kind of choice you have to make? Fortunately, we're now moving away from the outmoded engineering mentality, quantitative, very, very calculative mode of thinking, into a much more complex system of reflection. Now, for the first time, the leadership consists of many people in the humanities, more people in the humanities than in engineer. I think the tyranny of the engineer is now overcome. I think that's a good sign. And yet, the engineering mentality is persistent. The real ideology in China now is a kind of outmoded scientism. The belief that we can calculate, we can formulate, and we can do things for the people as a whole because we are intelligent. We have all the resources at our disposal. What we need is a true scientific spirit, which is humble, open, and of course rationalistic in a very broad sense. We need to calculate, we need to analyze, but at the same time, we need to be aware. The more we know what we ought to know and do not know. The more we enlighten the world, the more we are aware the veil of ignorance is very thick. The more we are aware that we can, through engineering, change the landscape, not just the Three Gorges, transfer water from the south to the north, to do urban construction by clearing everything to start from scratch. We think that our engineering mentality is going to transform the world, but we know the unintended negative consequences may turn out to be extremely dangerous. So that kind of mentality is serious. What is a more humane person? The values I outlined, these are great values. We can't call them universal values, such as freedom, rationality, legality, human rights, and the dignity of the individual. But they're not enough. If we do not have a sense of justice, I think the Islamic world has shown clearly to the Americans justice is just as important as freedom. If we do not have a sense of decency, of sympathy, empathy, and compassion. For example, if the human rights discourse is the only discourse in town, I am a billionaire, you are homeless, I respect your human rights, you respect mine, I'm not going to give you any money because I'm not legally constrained, nor morally constrained to do that. The only way I want to do it is because I have altruism. But from the Confucian point of view, if you're a successful person, the people who are more powerful, influential, have more access to information, ideas, ought to feel more obligated for the well-being of the society. This is the rules of the game that operate in China. That's why the psychology of suspicion, cynicism is so pervasive, because the country is unequal. So the Gini coefficient is 0.47 or something. China, not as bad as South Africa or Brazil or Nigeria, but worse than the US, than UK, all the other countries. China cannot afford it. Only about 40,000 really billionaires, and maybe, I don't know, certainly not more than 1 million so-called middle class. We're all beneficiaries of this system, but it's unequal. As many of us pointed out, there are more than, say, 300, at least 200 migrant workers. These are the people who generated the wealth, and yet they're not the beneficiaries of the system. And they suffered a lot. No matter how powerful China would become economically in terms of totalistic structure, in terms of per capita, China is very poor. China is only 1/5 of Japan's. I think even by the year 2030, when Chinese economy is the greatest of the world, the Chinese people are still poor. Now we are now about 94. Maybe we move up to 50, ranked 50. That's not good enough for a country that would be able to shape the direction of the world. So in the 21st century, the leadership needs to learn how to accumulate social capital, not just economic capital, how to enhance cultural competence, not just technical competence, how to develop cognitive, not just cognitive intelligence, but also ethical intelligence or emotional intelligence, not just material conditions, but spiritual values. I would suggest 2 areas, major challenge for the leadership. They may not have anything to do with economics, but it has a lot to do with the Chinese soul, with the Chinese mentality in the future. First, China, the leadership in particular, will have to learn about the meaning of religion in the 21st century. In the year 2000, when I first got invited to Davos, I was surprised that even those economists, Davos has been noted for its kind of a market fundamentalism, but the leaders already began to realize religion in the 21st century. That's the issue that I was asked to address. The Chinese leadership, both political, academic, mass media, doesn't understand religion. I'll give you one example why the Sino-American relationship has been so difficult. There's 77% of Americans that consider themselves Christians. That's very different from the situation in Europe. 55% of them are Protestants, and 20% more Catholics, and 2 Mormons. All the other religions, Muslims, Buddhists, all put together, only 6%. So if you don't understand religion, you don't understand Obama, you don't understand even some of the CEOs you consider purely economic animals, because religion features prominently. If you say, well, I like you, but I don't believe there's a God, I think the conversation stops, because people perceive you very wrongly. Anyway, we need to understand religion. We need to understand religion, especially in understanding our own culture. One of the major challenges to China's stability now is not simply to build up your military preparedness, but to deal with internal harmony. Because we don't understand religion, we don't understand our other nationalities, Tibetans and Uyghurs in particular. So the other challenge is our ability to understand identity politics. Now, 96% of Chinese are Han. All the minorities put together would be only 6%. So Han Chinese are totally incapable of understanding the feelings, the sentiments of so-called other nationalities. Our way of dealing with religion is ridiculous. The Falun Gong case, they made us into major trouble for so long now. If that happened in India, 小菜一碟, it's very easy to handle. And now the Tibetan situation is serious, and we consider it, so what? We need to open ourselves, open dialogue with people that we consider our adversaries. We need to become sensitized to religion, because if someone who's a believer, whether it's Christian believer or Buddhist believer, you don't change the person's mind by economic inducement. It matters very little. You don't change the mind of a person by political pressure or military confrontation. No way. You understand that the Roman Empire collapsed and Christianity survived. That's a good example. And we need to understand that. And if we understand religion, if we understand identity politics, we will be able to have some sense to not only economic development, political development, but cultural resources. And culture is something that's so precious. Let me end with the simple observation. If you look at the Confucian tradition, there are three distinctive features. One is learning civilization. That has been deeply embodied in modern Chinese history. Everybody is a learner. You know, we learn from the West. Very different from many other societies. Resist the West as if the West is the radical other. We try to embrace the West. Now, in our own mentality, every Chinese, I mean, educated Chinese, the Western element is the most strong. In other words, 70% of the cultural resources that we tap in discussing all kinds of things come from the West as a modern Chinese. It is also a very tolerant tradition. That's why three teachings in one: Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. But now we talk about 5 religions, including Christianity and Islam. And China is able to engage in dialogues with virtually all major civilizations. Our institute is interested in dialogue not only with Christians and Jews, but also with Muslims, with Iranian Muslims as well, with Hindu philosophers, with the Latin American countries, with people from Africa. In fact, one thing we learned from Africa is that there's an African notion that the earth is not a treasure given to us by our ancestors. The earth is a resource entrusted by numerous generations in the future for us to keep. It's a broad humanistic vision that we need to learn. It's Ubuntu, the idea of I am because you are. And so this soft Confucian cultural tradition cannot be realized in China unless China first learned vigorously to become economically vibrant. If we don't have a good legal system, we believe that government can be controlled by men, virtuous people. No way. I see many virtuous people become very corrupt with very little inducement. Not just the inducement of material goods, but inducement of reputation and so forth. So we need to learn to become economic men in the best sense of the term, and then move beyond, to tap our cultural resources and show the world there are other values that need to be able to help us. So one thing I've been doing, not very successfully, is the dialogue, Sino-American dialogue on core values. The confrontations between the two countries for the last few years are all under the name of dialogues, but there's no dialogue. Climate change, renminbi evaluation, not. So we need to begin the dialogue, and I think in England, I can see the dialogical situation is flourishing. And I urge Chinese students now, all in many areas, in business, in all kinds of areas, to come to England to study. Not necessarily you come here, you become better managers, or you become financially more aggressive and so forth. You learn how to be polite. You learn how to be decent. You learn, for example, how to, I think it's just amazing to see thousands of boats, line up the Thames Square under heavy rain and in a totally orderly fashion. This is the 60th anniversary of Queen's Jubilee. It's just amazing. And I think the Olympics show that England is able to do something that we need to learn. And I do believe the British Olympic opening is infinitely more significant, more moving, more humane than many of the other openings that we're aware of. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tu, for your most perceptive speech on the importance of religion. Well, this session has now come to an end, and as you can see, we are really behind our schedule. Therefore, you will only have a 10-minute short break. So the next session will start promptly at 11:15. And for audience who have chosen for the business session, please come back to this auditorium at 11:15. And for audience who have chosen the session on soft power, please proceed to the Wolfson Theater, where there are signs outside showing the directions to Wolfson Theater, or you can approach any of our volunteers. Speakers, please